Okay, we are ready.
Ακούγομαι. Okay. Λοιπόν, so it's our pleasure and honor, of course, to have Alessandro Portelli with us. Alessandro Portelli, you will all know, is an Italian scholar, a leading figure in oral history. He has taught American literature in the University of Rome, La Sapienza, but he is also a founding member of Gianni Bosio Circolo, 1972, right? His work demonstrates the value of an ethnographic approach to the modern past and, of course, primarily the value of a literary approach to narrative. In other words, interpreting narratives as narratives rather than as simple testimonies. A good example of this is the collection of essays entitled The Death of Luigi Trastulli, a well-known book, also in Greece, published in 1921. Among others, in 1999, he published the English title is The Order Has Been Carried Out. The English translation was in 2003, about the massacre of Jewish and non-Jewish civilians by Nazis in Rome in 1944, a significant event in Italian collective memory. In 2010, Alessandro Portelli published the essay Harlan County, which is a portrait of an American coal mining district in decline. However, for the purpose of this very short introduction, I made the following choice, not to make an excessive reference to his academic work. Instead, I'm going to present a snapshot of his biography and a few quotes of his own work with regard to the issues of our conference. So, in 1972, Alessandro Portelli, as I said, was a founding member of the Gianni Bosio Circolo. I quote, "They were based in Milan, and the key figure there was Gianni Bosio, who was a historian. He called himself an organizer of culture. His idea was to start grassroots culture groups and document the culture of the non-hegemonic classes, working class, marginal groups, peasants, farm workers. This was a very radical and controversial approach because until he came along in the early 50s, the history of the working class was the history of the organizations of the working class. Later, with respect to his research in the USA, I quote, I came back from this trip to America with these tapes and with a lot of radical poetry that I had picked up, especially black poetry. That was the beginning of my interest in black culture. In an interview entitled Crossing Cultures, it's the question, tell me, Sandro, when did you begin to get seriously interested in Kentucky history? Well, it came about with Barbara O'Dane singing, I hate capitalist system. It was the discovery that there was a history of class struggle in this country. I would like to close this brief introduction with some comments made by Alessandro Portelli on the meaning of the interview process and oral history research in general. For me, number one reason for doing the interview is an attempt to contribute to a struggle for equality. When you are trying to prove that working people or immigrants have a culture, that they have rights, at the same time you are trying to prove that equality is the aim. When I talk of the interviews as an experiment of equality, I have in mind something like testing each other's position, recognizing the barrier, but also talking across them and trying to imagine what it would be like if they didn't exist, making the best of our differences while trying to tear down the inequalities. The aim of the interview is like an utopic moment in which you attempt to speak to each other as you might in an ideal world of equality. To conclude, the idea of resistance holds a primary importance in Alessandro Portelli's writing, and the subject of his speech today about resistance in the 40s is something that, of course, we have been engaged in Greece for a long time, such as the debate on reprisals. So the title of his speech is War, Violence, and Ethics of Resistance. The floor is to Alexander.
Well, good evening, and thank you for this brilliant introduction and for this extraordinary opportunity to share with you these days in which we all learn a great deal about oral history and the world we're in. So I'd like to start with my first oral history interview. 1971, Dante Bartolini. Dante Bartolini was a factory worker, a hog killer, an herb doctor, a folk poet, and the political commissary of the Antonio Gramsci Partisan Brigade in 1943-44. And I quote from the interview. We created the Antonio Gramsci Partisan Brigade, and we kept on throughout the glorious deeds of the resistance. We attacked the Germans and their fascist lackeys on the roads from Bindoli to Leonessa, to the villages around Leonessa. We fought, we carried out many actions that I have no time to describe now, good or bad, and our sufferings were great. Along the roads, with gasoline and fire bottles, we burned their trucks, we burned their armored cars. People died, those poor people inside who couldn't get out. We carried flasks filled with gasoline. We hurled the fire flasks at them, and then we fought the Germans hand to hand. Okay, this is this is 1971. So what do you hear in 1971? The glorious deed of the War of Liberation, the heroes of resistance. I did this interview, I transcribed it, I published it, and so on and so forth. And it was only like 40 years later, when we all were different, that I noticed a small but very significant semantic shift. His reference to the poor people inside who couldn't get out. I mean, Dante Bartolini was absolutely proud of the fight in the resistance. But somehow through the cracks of this epic narrative, there seeps a feeling of pity for those poor people, for the enemies that he and his comrades killed in action. Years later, I talked to Lucia Ottobrini. Lucia Ottobrini was a freedom fighter. She died recently. She was over 90 years old. She carried out the armed struggle in Rome and near Rome in 1943-44. She was a fighting partisan. I hadn't planned it this way, but most of the names that I will be quoting will be women. And it wasn't planned. It just happened that way. And this is what this is a great interview, because Lucia Ottobrini wouldn't talk about the resistance. But I was interviewing her husband, who wouldn't stop talking about it. And she was a perfect lady. So as I was interviewing her husband in their parlor, she would come in with a glass of water, a cup of coffee. So one day she came in with a tray and a small espresso. And I got up to get the cup, and her husband asked her a question. She answered the question, and she spoke for 2 hours, standing there with the espresso cup, and this is what she said. This was 1999. I'm quoting the dates of the interview because, of course, if oral history is a relationship between two moments in time, it is when people said certain things is as important as what they said. She said, "War is war. There's nothing you can do about it." I remember the trucks filled with young boys going home, and they were singing in die Heimat, es wird besser gehen. At home, all will be better. These are things that you always carry with you. I remember those days all my life. And I remember the people they massacred at the Fosse Ardeatine. They're always with me. Because I don't like to even hear about it. It's an awful, terrible, frightful thing. Some people write about it freely and easily. Not for me, not I. The enemy is a human being too. And I'm very, very infinitely sorry. These are very bitter things, and I think it left a mark on me. For one thing, it made me more mature. I don't feel innocent. No one is innocent, and no one can call themselves guilty. So the enemy too was human. The enemy too was poor people. In a diary entry written during the underground guerrilla in Rome, Franco Calamandrei, a writer and also a member of the armed struggle in Rome, he wrote, and I kept telling myself, there's no such thing as a war. There are only individuals facing the war. Always individuals, always and only individuals. In a 2014 interview, a rank-and-file partisan in the working-class neighborhood of Quadraro in Rome, which is one of the neighborhoods that suffered a Nazi massacre, he recalled, "The first German we killed, we buried him around here, not far from here, by the creek. I was sick for a week. I kept thinking of his children, if he was married, of his mother." What is the definitive work on the resistance, Claudio Pavone, a historian and a former partisan, explains, the problem is that partisans were no longer covered by the anonymity that is granted a priori to the regular soldier the moment he kills an enemy. Because when these individuals began the resistance, the enemy in turn stopped being a mere collective identity. The partisans were individuals, and the enemy in turn ceased to be a mere collective enemy and became a specific, an individual being, both as a German and even more as a fascist. In other words, as opposed to regular soldiers, to fascists, to Nazism, and even to later terrorists, the partisans were not shooting at a uniform. They were aware that they were shooting at persons. Some were pained by the reactions against the fascists, says Mario Fiorentini, Lucia Ottobrini's husband, also a partisan. He died at the age of 104 recently. Marvelous man. I have to tell you this. He was a self-educated mathematician, and he became one of the world's most important mathematicians. And once he told me, I'm a very lonesome person, because only 12 people understand what I do, and 11 of them are in Japan. Anyway, he wouldn't stop talking about the resistance. He said, some of us were pained by the actions that we did against the fascists, because the action against the fascists, it's actually against individuals. It's civil war. So historian Claudio Pavone notes that, of course, the question of partisan violence must be placed in the context of the, quote, infinitely much larger violence of the World War in which it was involved. The great symbolic difference between the violence of the resistance and the violence of the established armies and police bodies lies in the fact that the actions of the resistance were a violation of the state monopoly on violence. Citizens were no longer more or less conscious instruments or beneficiaries of state violence. They became themselves administrators of violence. In this way, the moral problems and the sharp demands generated by the boundless violence perpetrated by millions of men throughout the whole war are downloaded on a few thousand partisans who choose to enact violence. The reason I became anti-fascist was that the day I realized that no matter what the partisans did, and some of the actions are debatable, they never said they were obeying orders. The partisans always took responsibility for what they did. And this is the foundation of the democracy we used to have in Italy and we hope to keep having in the future. Like Maria Teresa Regar, communist partisan, she said, when the Nazis came to Rome and they came through Porta San Paolo, and there was a spontaneous resistance of people who just went. And she says, I didn't go to Porta San Paolo because the Communist Party told me to. I went to Porta San Paolo because I felt that it was the right thing to do. And she fought there. So no partisan ever claimed that they were innocent because they were obeying orders. There's a famous passage in Franco Calamandre's diary where he talked about this double contradictory consciousness of doing something which is both just and unjust at the same time. And he talks about himself as a young partisan waiting on the corner for the German platoon that will soon be blown up by his comrades. And he says, the way I was waiting in Piazza di Spagna, on the Spanish steps, for the German platoon to appear at the end of Via del Babuino, and I thought those men would soon die. And I didn't care. I didn't care at all. But as I stood there in the warm afternoon sun, and I saw them march by, the aria of E Lucean le Stelle from Tosca, from Puccini, sounded inside me, and some tears came trickling down my cheeks. So as they fought in the resistance, partisans were inevitably involved in actions that were necessary and just at the time. But then they were also in conflict with their own conscience, with the very reasons why they had joined the resistance. And they were also in conflict with the ethics of peacetime in which those war actions are being remembered and somehow evaluated. Unlike the fascists, the partisans were not the bearers of an ideology of violence and death. The fact that they used violence, that they killed, and the fact that these actions are somehow erased from a pacified memory in which the only partisans are the dead partisans, and not, generates complicated splits within their own consciousness. Rosario Bentivegna, who was one of the heroes of the resistance in Rome, he told me once that he had chosen to study medicine because, he said, I quote, I thought that if I'm called to serve in the army, I will not have to kill, but will do all I can to save lives. And then after his first guerrilla action, after his first armed action, he says, we were in shock. I had shot a man. I couldn't speak. I couldn't go back. I couldn't be among my friends. And the split begins in the moment of action and is perpetrated in memory. His comrade, who later became his wife, Carla Capponi, another of the symbolic heroes and heroines of the War of Liberation, agreed that the inevitable use of violence in the War of Liberation exacted a heavy psychological price. Killing is an act against nature, she concluded. And to me, the greatest gift that we receive from these people is precisely that they went against their own nature to fight for our freedom. This, I think, is the greatest sacrifice. And she talks about her first action. We killed a German officer in Via Veneto, in the center of Rome. I hadn't had the baptism of fire, so they told me, this time it's your turn. And I felt like dying, my dear, because shooting a man, and in the back too, I tell you, it seemed a terribly cowardly thing to do. I wanted to call to him to say, excuse me, please. So he turns around, at least he has the time to respond. So after we cross the street, Bentivegna, who was with me, says, come on, shoot. And I, nothing. And when we come to the corner, at his signal, I shoot just widely, at random, 3 or 4 times. He too shoots, and then we drop down. I remember it was raining. But this officer had a briefcase that we were supposed to take. And, you know, taking this briefcase, tearing it from his hand, it was as if we had torn the heart. I think that I kept my pistol in my hand. I didn't even put it back in my pocket. We walked down, we reached Piazza Barberini, and I had a terrible crisis. And I said, no, it's impossible. We can't go on do it. We can't do this. And Bentivegna said, look, they've already killed. One of our comrades has been tortured. Another one was murdered. Another comrade has hanged himself in jail so that he would not speak under torture. It's a struggle, and you must see it this way. Otherwise, women ought to stay home. You see, he was trying to humiliate me. But I'll tell you the truth. It was a very, very hard thing to do. I think much of it depends on the fact that killing is against nature, for some people, at least. Of course, there are monsters. For them, it's a pleasure. In fact, I think I was ill. I could hardly eat, let alone I wasn't eating because we didn't have anything to eat to begin with, because I always agonized over this. Of course, it was a just fight, but going from conspiracy to armed action was a hard step to take, and not everybody could make it. I remember asking another heroine of the resistance in Umbria, Valchiria Terradura. This was at the launching of her autobiography, and where she says that she had been an administrator of death. And I asked him, well, what were your feelings then? And she says, it's a good question, and I've been thinking about it all this time. Remember, her name was Valkyria. I mean, and her last name was Terradura, hard earth. So, I mean, this was a very tough woman. I had qualms about it, especially when I attacked trucks. And perhaps I saw at the wheel young faces, young men. But in the end, I persuaded myself that this was the enemy. They were going to cause trouble wherever they went. Yet I had qualms, and it pained me, because Carla Capponi, that I quoted earlier, wrote in her autobiography, we fought with a woman's heart. The title of her biography is Con cuore di donna, with a woman's heart, and she talks about these things. And it weighed on me. It weighed very much. It's a hard memory to keep. There's one of the partisans in the neighborhood of Montesacro, where I used to live, recalled that once he was given a gun, and he was told to wait for some fascists to get on public transportation and shoot them. He was 16 years old. And he says, this comrade came. He carried a pistol with 3 bullets in it, and he says, wait for some fascists to get on the tramway. And he didn't explain anything. He didn't tell me anything. Just go and shoot. Fortunately, nobody got on the tram. And after a while, just after curfew, I went home and I gave back my gun, and I never used it again. However, Carla Caponi says, it's against nature, but I'm glad I did it. It's this huge contradiction. I would have felt like a coward, because after all, we put our own lives at stake all the time. This was a different time. And the same ethics that prevail in peacetime, the ethics that they had grown up with, were somehow suspended. Lucia Ottobrini said it was a different time. And Marisa Musso, another fighting partisan, she says, it was a situation of more than terror. There was this constant violence. Those 9 months of Nazi occupation in Rome were so tense. It was a matter of life and death, my life or your life. If I see someone that's shooting him, I shoot him first. Non-violence was no option. Even beyond the ethics of self-defense, the partisans had to take upon themselves the responsibility of going against the grain of their own humanistic values. Like Carla Caponi, Maria Teresa Rigard talks about killing as something abnormal. And she says, I didn't really dwell long about it, because I asked her, well, what did you think back then? And she said, I didn't really dwell much about it. I thought that we had to do these things to chase Germans from Rome. This was the end. It surely wasn't that the idea of killing people pleased me. My daughters asked me, how can you be? Didn't you think of these things? And actually, I didn't even want to think about it, because if I had, maybe, I don't know, I might not have the strength. We were like shielded, as if we wanted to protect ourselves from this, because it was such an abnormal thing for a person like us. For me, it wasn't so much fear as the thought that if I let myself go a little bit, then I might have collapsed. I might not have been able to stand it. Whenever possible, the partisans attempted to retain at least a remnant of legality, of penal and procedural courts and everything. This, of course, was not always possible. Bruno Zenoni, who was a leader of the Gramsci Brigade in Terni, he was charged after the war with murder for the execution of fascist spies during the last days of resistance. Because at the height of the Cold War, while the fascists were being freed from jail and exonerated, thousands of partisans were being tried for murder and violence and jailed. Just 4 or 5 years after liberation. So in court, he said, he told me, and this was an interview in the mid-90s. The other interviews with the partisans from Rome were 1999, 2001. This was 78. Well, he says the brigade met, and they decided that certain fascist spies had to be executed. And the verdicts were carried out as conditions allowed. You couldn't just arrest someone, put him in jail, you had to do whatever you could. Anything went. You couldn't make any noise. You couldn't use a gun. I mean, in fact, when we were put on trial, when we were accused of these acts, even if it had taken place in a somewhat barbarous way, they used knives, I told the judge, you ought to have been with us. You ought to have been fighting for Italy with us. Because if you had been with us, we would have had you act as a judge. It would have all been recorded. It would have all been done regularly. But you were not with us. So Bruno Zenoni describes an emergency in which the German search and destroy operation had almost wiped out the brigade. And the partisans were fighting for their very survival. But on the other hand, Valchiria Terradura goes on to tell a story of mixed feelings, in which the fact that the partisans controlled the territory enabled them to establish a makeshift legal procedure. This is another part of Umbria. And yet, even the legal procedure could not be separated from feelings for personal relationships. You were dealing with people. Yes, I wasn't especially sorry when I had to execute 2 members of the German SS who had been decorated with, 2 Italian members of the German SS, who had been decorated with second-class Iron Crosses. So for the Germans, these were actually heroes. When we captured them, we said, we had to set up a partisan tribunal. It didn't take long to sentence them to death, as was the case of another spy, a Hungarian woman. The first time we caught her, we forgave her because we thought she didn't know what she was doing. She didn't think she had done anything wrong. Her country was on the other side. So for her, it was normal to be an ally of the Nazis. But when we realized that after we had acquitted her, she kept spying on us and putting in danger the whole brigade and all the country women, all the rural families that were helping us, we decided that she had to die. And so the anger at Nazi war crimes was one of the things that helped the partisans steel themselves for action. And Marisa Musso went on to fight to join the Palestinian resistance. And Marisa Musso says, when you hear this woman, Giulia Spizzichino, a Jewish woman in Rome, this beautiful, extraordinary woman, who tells you that all her family was killed, a 16-year-old boy, a 17-year-old one, a 19-year-old one, 21 members of her family, the grandfather, either executed at the Post-Ardeatine massacre or gassed at Auschwitz. Well, this, even now, this is 6 years later, even now this fills me with such, it's not even just hatred. Forgive me, it may seem strange, but we didn't kill enough of them. I wish we'd killed more. I realize that it may sound cruel, but that's the way I think. If I say that with a bomb, I blew up a German soldier, I don't think of him as a mother's son, as a father of a little child. I don't experience it that way. I see the torturers, the raiders of the Jews, the guards of the extermination camps. So, Carla Capponi, Maria Teresa Rigard, Lucia Ottobrini, all these marvelous ladies, and also Marisa Musso, were awarded gold and silver medals after the war for their actions in the War of Liberation. Maria Teresa Rigard, still seething with anger, when she recalled the text of the official motivation. She was arrested and taken to the Nazi prison in Via Tasso, but even under interrogation, she always retained a manly and an exemplary attitude, not revealing anything. This manly, she says, I struck it off. I told them, take that manly off. I can't stand it. Because, of course, part of the reason why women prevail in this narrative is that men somehow feel less of legitimation, of right to express their feelings, their contradictions. And in this case, women speak for all. But it's both Maria Teresa Regard and Marisa Muso insist that no, it wasn't a feminist thing. We don't even know about it. I just think, Maria Teresa Regard says, that women are more practical. We saw the war was being run so badly. Who knows? We reacted more. There couldn't be a feminist mentality because this wasn't the time. But certainly the idea of affirming women's right to participate, to count, yes, it was there. Marisa Musso writes that when she contacted the head of Giorgio Amendola, the head of the communist underground organization, and she wanted to join the underground guerrilla, Amendola told her, look, you just ought to stand by your fiancé, Valentino Gerratana, who was a partisan. Valentino Gerratana later was the editor of the final critical edition of the works of Antonio Gramsci. Back then, he was, fighting in the streets in Rome. You ought to stand by your fiancé and darn his socks at night. And she says, neither Amendola nor I had the least idea that there would be a feminist movement. But back then, I didn't have the least idea of how to darn socks either. So, and this is why Carla Caponi's title, Con cuore di donna, with a woman's heart, is not just a sentimental statement. It's a statement of the contradiction. Because with a woman's heart, you did things that were hard for anyone to countenance. Who can I talk about these things to? Says Lucio Tobrini told me. Basically, they could only talk to each other. Because the greatest, if I had to choose one passage of one interview of the many I've done, it would be the moment in which, with this tray and this cup of espresso getting colder by the minute, Lucio Tobrini said, I keep asking myself, was it me that did these things? And throughout the war, she was very, very religious. Throughout the war, I didn't talk to him. And I said, because you thought that even Jesus wouldn't understand? And she says, I went back to talking to Jesus after it was over. I mean, they did things that were so painful that even Jesus couldn't understand them. They went, and so they could only talk to each other, because only those who had taken part in this harrowing experience could understand. And when I worked, I did a number of interviews with the former partisans in Rome. The astonishing discovery I made, which was a well-known fact, but nobody had noticed before, was that they all married each other. There were at least 7 weddings between partisans in the 2 months after the liberation of Rome. Some of these marriages collapsed, like Bentivegna and Capponi. Others lasted 80 years, like Lucio Tobrini. But the fact is, they could only talk to each other. Maria Teresa Regar says she had never even thought of marrying Franco Calamandrei. But when he asked her, she said, well, yeah, who else can I marry after all we've done? We were all people who were having a hard time, who suffered solitude, hunger, fear. In the end, it was a relief to have someone to love and to be loved. For some of these women, it also meant overcoming sexual taboos. By the end of the partisan war, Carla Capponi was pregnant. And Lucio Tobrini says, of course, Mario Fiorentini and we went all the way. He was my first man. It's logical. And of course, it's logical that when it was over and when they all married each other. So one of the things that they all point out is how hard it is to talk about it. I will, one of the stories that Dante Bartolini told me that day was a story of a confrontation in which he wasn't present, but he told me as if he'd been there, in which he says the partisans killed a number of fascist officials in cold blood. Apparently, this was not so. Even the fascist sources say that it was actually an armed confrontation. So why is he talking about killing them in cold blood? Because he is. What he's talking is about the feelings that they cultivated in that moment, and even if because the fascists had been surrounded and they came out shooting and the partisans shot them, but what he's saying is there was such anger, such hatred that even if they had come out with their hands raised, they would have killed them anyway. This is what he's trying to express with this metaphor, and this he's trying to tell us how different it was, how complicated, and how it felt inside. One of the members of the Gramsci Brigade told me afterward, it wasn't easy to go back afterwards. You'd been in the heat of the battle, the constant danger, the sorrow for the losses, the cruelty of the enemy. You had to deal with these things. No one can imagine what it's like to come out of a war, of such a war, and to go back to real life, a life of cleanliness, dialogue, reasoning. After you've been 8-9 months in the mountains, you come down, you're half a beast. No two ways about it. You're not a normal human being. Today I say I was an animal. In one of his poems, Dante Bartolini describes the partisans as bloodthirsty wolves. He's talking about himself. I realized that in those times I was out of my mind. You come down from the mountains with that constant hatred, the war, the weapons, always expecting that they would shoot you in the back. You're so charged that before you get back in line, it isn't easy. It isn't easy. So one of the things that the partisans had to do during this terrible time was resisting the danger of turning into bearers of death, as Carla Capponi says. War is alien to the core of their identity, and this makes them different from their enemies who cherish the cult of violence, who cherish the myth of death, including their own. And I'm impressed by when Mario Filipponi says real life. It's just like Lucio Tobrini sensed that this was a suspended time. This was a time when other principles, other ethics prevailed. His wife, Gianni Angelini, who was a member of the brigade, and they married, he says, back then, the world was very different. So, so there is pain, but there is no repentance. Rosario Bentivegna is a partisan who lit the fuse to the bomb that killed 33 Nazi policemen in the center of Rome, which was followed by the Nazi massacre at the Fosse Ardeatine. So he lived the rest of his life under threats, death threats, under attacks from the right, because of what he'd done. And yet, the attack took place in a place in Rome called Via Rasella. And to the end of his life, Rosario Bentivegna said, yes, I was there at Via Rasella, and I'm still standing there. So to him, as to Gianni Angelini, Lucio Tobrini, Maria Teresa Argar, see the difference between the men and the women. I'm closing. Because of the following the action of the partisans in Via Rasella, the Nazis killed 335 men at the Fosse Ardeatine in Rome. And I asked him, did you ever go to the Fosse Ardeatine? And he says, yes. One day when there wasn't anybody, I got on my bicycle and I went. And I said, and what did you think? And he says, this is an intrusive question. I don't want to make a show of my feelings. The difference precisely is that Rosario Bentivegna refuses to express his feelings. Carla Capponi and Maria Teresa Regard and Lucio Tobrini make an effort to do this. But the feelings are the same. So the memory of the struggle to them is a complicated mix of pain and pride. Lucio Tobrini, to whom I dedicate this conversation, Lucio Tobrini remembers the day that she was awarded a silver medal for her role in the resistance. Quote, the medal was delivered by the Minister of Defense, Paolo Emilio Taviani, who had been a partisan himself. So the medal was delivered by the Minister of Defense. I was standing in line along with 2 Air Force officers who were also being decorated. So the minister approached me gently, and he said, Madam, are you the wife? He thought I was the wife of a dead soldier. I thought it was a widow of the war hero. And I said, no, sir, the medal is for me. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Alessandro. I think that within this context of cruelty and death, the resistance movement and the civil war, that Alessandro Portelli elaborates both on the ideals that motivate the actions of the guerrilla fighters, etc., but as well on the inner dimensions and this inner conflict and split in a struggle to maintain their sense of humanity. So I think that his talk is both inspiring from an analytical point of view, but also the emotional impact and, of course, the formation of subjectivity. So we can open the discussion, a lot to talk about. We can get some questions or your remarks. Yes, Ms. Rosenthal.
First of all, thank you very much for this paper. I must say I was...
Please use a microphone so that people from WebEx can hear. Thank you.
I'm very moved by the quotations you gave us and the insight in your interviews, because the whole time I was searching in my memory if I remind one interviewee of a soldier of the German Wehrmacht who spoke like this. And I didn't find one case in my memory. They didn't speak about killing. I had to ask in the questioning part of the interview, can you remember the first death by killing? And they only talk about their comrades. There was no justification. Of course, we had to fulfill orders. So it's totally different. And to have this contrast, it really shocks me. And I have to think more about it, how we could explain. I would not go on the individual level. It would be too easy to say the Germans have no moral and the Italians have the moral. I think it's a good sign that the institution of the partisan groups in Italy and the Wehrmacht gave a totally different context. And you can say the German Wehrmacht, as well, I had also interviews with members of the killing units who presented themselves as Wehrmacht soldiers. I found it then out in archive that it was not true. That coming in this organization was a dehumanization process. And of course, in the present of the interviews, they went through several years and they didn't have any sign of guilt feelings in comparison to the interviews I did with Holocaust survivors. I never did an interview with someone who has no survivor guilt. And the interesting thing would be if we compare your interviewees or your interviews with interviews of other partisan groups. Would you think it would be the same if you would do, for example, in Ukraine or Russia?
I don't really know, and I mean, Greece is a good place to ask this kind of questions. But I think the difference is, aside from ideology, but the basic difference is what Claudio Pavone points out. That is, a regular soldier is an anonymous person who is killing anonymous persons. A partisan is an individual who kills individuals. And this, because of course a partisan is a volunteer, because they take responsibility, and I think when they do not abdicate to their sense of being responsible for their actions, they also do not abdicate from their capacity of seeing the enemy as a human being. You know, and I was basically, I think I was fortunate in the fact that there were so many women in the resistance, as opposed to there were no women in the regular army. And the women were able to articulate these feelings, which Rosario Bentivegna somehow kept to himself because he couldn't find the words. Or Dante Bartolini expressed through metaphors, the metaphor of shooting the Nazis in cold blood, the fascists in cold blood, which he didn't, and that small crack in my first interview, the poor people who couldn't get out, and what fascinates me is that I didn't notice this the first time I heard it, and all the time that I used that interview. There's a, the time is important. I did these interviews 50 years later. Maybe, well, Marisa Musso told me something which I thought was very, very significant. She said, of course, we former partisans used to go to be invited to speak in schools and things like that. And in the 70s, the questions we were asked were, how were you organized? Where did you find the weapons? What was the strategy? Nowadays, 90s, the questions are, were you afraid? What did it feel like? You know, there's the whole political context in which these stories are being told has changed. Because, of course, 1970s were the height of the radical movement. Those were also the years of the Red Brigades, and the Red Brigades claimed that they were the new partisans, and they didn't realize that their ethics were completely different. So, and ultimately, I think this is the power of oral history. Oral history tells you a lot more than other sources about the subjectivity, about the feelings, about the inner forum of people, rather than just the hard facts. For many of these women, these were the first interviews in which they talked about these things. Not because I'm a special interviewer, but because the time had come. The time was ripe and they could talk about it.
Ricky?
Yes, you already mentioned the Red Brigades. I wanted to ask you something about this. I think you have shown very clearly how the ethics of war violence are both historically and cultural determined, but also gendered. But when you said 71, the interview with Bartolini, it immediately brought me back to the time I was in Italy as well, and what was the climate there. So I wanted to ask you about the context of the interviews. So first of all, how did those younger generation who were being tempted at that time to go to armed struggle, how did they look at the partisans? You already halfly answered this question. And the other thing is, how did your interviewees were influenced by this climate? And maybe, I was thinking, maybe when Dante Bartolini in 1971 said these poor things, maybe it was kind of resistance against this climate which was being formed in Italy by then.
Well, 1971, Dante Bartolini is the person that wrote the song in which celebrating the workers' resistance against after mass firings at the steelworks. He says the great victory is near. So in 1971, we came from not only the student 60s, but also a season of great struggles in the factories. I was one of those people who marched in the streets those years, shouting, "Padroni borghesi ancora pochi mesi," masters, bourgeois. You still have a few months left. So we thought, the climate was, it's amazing to think about it today. History is marching toward freedom, as another working class singer put it in one of the songs that he made. So revolution meant, and to to many, revolution also meant, taking up arms. So this was the context, and Dante was glorifying armed struggle, which is fascinating because when that little aside about the poor people. Well, I didn't hear it, and because of course I was after, when I did the partisan interviews, 1997, 1999. Well, incidentally, all the interviews were one-on-one in the interviewees' homes. Well, Berlusconi was in power. We had 1996, 1995 was more or less the end of the anti-fascist foundation of Italian democracy. We had a coalition in government that was formed by political forces that did not identify with the Italian constitution that was based on the ethics of resistance. There is a constitution in which you don't just vote, but in which you take action responsibility every day. We had Berlusconi. We had the Northern League that was then openly separatist. You had the neo-fascists. For the first time in Europe, a neo-fascist party was in power in a Western country. And so this was a time of rediscovering the meaning of memory. Because one of the things that were happening along with this rise of the right back then was an attack on memory, an attack on history, historical revisionism, the partisans as irresponsible criminals who did not turn themselves in and cause the poor Nazis to execute all these people, these things. So you couldn't, and I think the most important thing that had happened in between was, even more than the rise, was the women's movement, was the recognition that not only by women, but as a general principle, that not just that the person is political, but that feelings are political, that that you have a right and even a responsibility to deal with your feelings rather than suppressing them, as Teresa Regar was trying to do during the resistance. You had to open up to this, and I think this really changed the context. You could no longer take for granted that anti-fascism would be a shared value. In fact, today we're beginning to feel that anti-fascism is against an oppositional concept. And on the one hand, so you had to problematize your memory, and you had to come to terms with immaterial facts that were essential in the ways in which the struggle was carried out. Those things did not exist in '71 yet. So, and of course, we didn't have a sense that the great victory was near. We weren't talking about great victories anymore. So this was a completely different context.
Vasilis Dalkavoukis.
Professor Portelli, thank you very much here for your speech. Okay. I listened very carefully to your quotations, but I didn't hear at all the term class in the speech of your, in the talking of your informants. And I wonder if there is, what can we learn from all this situation for the comparison between 1971 and the end of the century, etc. Is there any notion about necessary violence or maybe useful violence? For example, in the Greek Constitution, there is, in the last article, a notion about useful violence. And I wonder if there is a type of gentrification of memory, or worse, gentrification of the research questions. So we asked, how did you organize the struggle? And now, if you were afraid of that, is that a self-gentrification? Is a gentrification connected to the social, political, economic environment? What happens? I would ask you with really interested about the nature of violence and not the notion of if it is natural to be violent, but the nature of the violence itself. Thank you.
Well, no doubt that the partisans not only thought that their violence was necessary, but they also thought it was useful, and which is why they've never recanted. They never repented. They never. But there's one other thing that happened between 1971 and 1976. The Red Brigades. I remember before the Red Brigades were only the conclusion of a process in the New Left and the Radical Left, in which violence was not perceived either as necessary or as useful, but as a good in itself. If you use violence, then you are more revolutionary than if you use other means. This was, I marched in demonstrations in which others, not I, screamed, "Vietnam wins because it shoots." And of course, yes, Vietnam won because it shot. But we didn't in the 70s. In the 70s, the idea that violence was a positive good was in part derived from certain aspects of the Black liberation movement in the 60s, which had to do more with gender than with race. In other words, it's complicated, but Malcolm X, who was one of my heroes, he never claimed that violence was better than nonviolence. Let me put the written. What he claimed was that they had the right to decide for themselves which weapons they were going to use for their liberation. So he has a famous paper called "The Ballot or the Bullet." You vote or you use, and it says it depends. And he also always made it very clear that violence had begun elsewhere. I'm looking for the quotes. And I will give you a quote from Martin Luther King as well, if I can find it. Here. Malcolm X said, "How are we going to be nonviolent in Mississippi, as violent as you were in Korea? How can you justify being nonviolent in Mississippi and Alabama when your churches are being bombed and your little girls are being murdered, and at the same time you're going to be violent with Hitler or Tojo or someone else you don't even know?" And Martin Luther King, they applauded us when we nonviolently decided to sit down at lunch counters. They applauded us on the freedom rides when we took blows and did not fight back. They praise us when I say, be nonviolent toward Bull Connor, well-known fascist, racist official. Be nonviolent toward Jim Clark. There is something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse you and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. So, in the first place, they place the question of violence and nonviolence in the context of the violence of the state. Now, the problem with the Red Brigades is that the violence of the state was very much their own invention. I mean, as all bourgeois states and capitalist states, there was repression, but we were not under a military dictatorship. And there were mass struggles going on. And the Red Brigades claimed that they were the new partisans. But one of the differences between them and the partisans was that it was only after they were caught, arrested, and put in jail that some of them began to question what they had done. So that all of the partisans that I talked to, including Marisa Musul, who is the least problematic, and she was ultra-left, and she was a supporter of the PLO in Palestine and everything. But she says they don't understand what we did and what we meant. So while in all these cases, and I think the lesson from Malcolm X is it depends. It depends on the context, it depends on the history, but it's our decision, not theirs. And one of the things that happened after Malcolm was that somehow the Black Panther Party conceived the idea of taking up arms as a positive, as a necessary and positive revolutionary value. Incidentally, the Red Brigades never shot anyone. The Black Panther Party never shot anyone. Malcolm X never shot anyone. But while for Malcolm this was a political matter, for the Red Brigades it was more of a retrieval of manhood, a gender thing, because they, and Malcolm has pages about this too, there's a sense in Black memory that slavery and unemployment and segregation unmanned the black males, and the only way that you can be a real man is by taking up arms. There are stories by Richard Wright in the 30s about this, a gun as a substitute for another part of a man's body. And and because a lot of the Italian radical left was fascinated with the Black Panther Party, this idea that taking up arms was itself a revolutionary act. And again, it was very much implicated with male chauvinism. Some of the groups that talked more about arms and shooting and were like Potere Operaia, were the ones in which women had the least presence. Another of the organizations, the most important organizations, Lotta Continua, split and closed down on the gender question. So, in a way, the combination of the women's movement and the Red Brigades and the incompatibility between these things created this, on the one hand, this mythology of violence, and on the other hand, this rejection of violence as a value. What Malcolm is talking about is what you were talking about: useful violence. There's no objection a priori to using violence. It depends on the historical context. The historical context of the resistance was not the historical context of Italy in the 70s, and that's all. Sorry, it took me longer.
I guess we could go on talking overnight, but unfortunately we have to stop it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.